the reptile hobby has better welfare than most other pets. There isn't an enormous reptile welfare crisis within the hobby or the trade.
Welcome to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is DILLON, and thank you so much for tuning in today. On this episode, I'm speaking with Tony Wigley, who is the founder of Responsible Reptile Keeping. RRK is an international organization that is designed to help promote, protect, and support responsible reptile keeping. Not only do they help support and promote the privilege for us to continue to keep these incredible animals, but they also promote and advocate for higher welfare standards and higher levels of husbandry, very similar to what we promote on this podcast as well. The sort of philosophies between the two, my podcast as well as Responsible Reptile Keeping, really do align almost perfectly. In this episode, Tony talks about how he got into reptile keeping, his history with that really laid a foundation for what he's doing today. And we also the main meat and potatoes of this episode is really discussing the battle that we have with animal rights groups. Now, we all know that once in a while, animal rights groups do have rightful criticism of herpetoculture, but a lot of the times they use wild claims, they have unsupported facts, and they become a very difficult organization to fight against. So the goal always is, how do we protect our freedom and our privilege to keep these animals while simultaneously leveling up our care? We never want to fight for the right to keep reptiles just solely for the right to keep a reptile. We want to be making sure that we are highlighting all the benefits of reptile keeping and punching the holes through the animal rights arguments that are actually very straw man type arguments that don't hold a lot of weight and actually do damage to these animals in captivity, even in the wild as well. So in this episode, we talk all about that, and of course, Tony talks about responsible reptile keeping, what it does, how it's going, how he's using it to promote the proper message. And moving forward, there's some incredible ideas. I cannot wait. They're only 4 months into this project, and it's already creating quite a buzz on the internet. I know a few of you have actually recommended them as a guest, so that's why we're having this conversation now, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Before we jump into the episode, if you are looking for more information on this podcast, head to animalsathomenetwork.com. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this podcast. There is an affiliate link in both the YouTube description and the show notes. If you would like to help produce the show by funding the production, whether that's space that I have to pay for, a server space for the podcast, equipment, my time, whatnot, you can do that over at patreon.com/animalsathome. And of course, then you're automatically added to the Discord server, which you can have conversation with like-minded keepers. Thank you so much to everyone who's been sharing the show on Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. That really does help bring new eyeballs to the podcast, or ears to the podcast as well, and I do very much appreciate it. Let's jump into this episode with Tony. Enjoy.
Welcome to the GoFundMe for the Ball Python Deep Dive Project. This is an episodic docu-series. We want to include all the relevant studies on ball pythons and then weave that into the story, weave that into the journey of discovery for the viewer. But this isn't just a documentary, we're doing real science at the same time. So we're creating an international study on how ball pythons use their enclosures. And then finally, we want to analyse all the interpretations, all the footage of wild animals. Bring it all together, extract the data from studies, look at this holistic viewpoint, and then identify the gaps. And then go out to Ghana ourselves and film those gaps. We want to go to Ghana with a team of professionals and film ball pythons in the wet season. Will there be so much flooding that ball pythons are forced to climb for refuge? Or will they just be moving in their environment? Let's find out. Either way, we'll show what we find. This is something of an order of magnitude that has never been done before. We want to set a new bar and put it right up here. So if you would like to help in any way to make this possible, then please check out the GoFundMe.
Awesome. Well, Tony, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's very exciting, I have to say.
Yeah, I've been watching your project, and I've had a few people reach out and say, hey, you got to have them on. And so I can't wait to get into the project you're working on. But let's give yourself a little bit of background, because you have been in herpetoculture for a long time, and you've had sort of an array of jobs, starting from a young boy working with reptiles. So why don't you just kind of give us a little bit of your reptile history?
Yeah, it's true. I've been around for a while, but I have to say I've been rather under the radar, so to speak. So I started working with reptiles back in the late 1980s at what was then the biggest reptile house in Europe. It was based in a place called Walsall in the middle of England, and it was run by a guy called Dave Lester. And he was essentially the reptile godfather of the UK, maybe even of Europe. And being at that store at the age of 15, 16, right through for a good few years, I got to meet anybody who was anybody in the UK. So just to throw out a few names that UK and European reptile guys would know, I was hanging around with Mark O'Shea, Luke Yeomans, John Coote, Jim Pether, Ray Hine, so many names that people recognize. And I was always the young kid, like the vivarium cleaner, the lowest of the low, sat around these great herpetological giants, just soaking up all their information and talking to them. I had access to the top brains, and that was quite a privileged position. And then after Dave died, my boss died, I was still in touch with all these guys. So I became essentially a professional herpetological sidekick. I was working with all these guys on the projects that they were doing, on the animals that they were working with, and on the everything that they were involved with, to get me involved. And again, that was quite a privilege. I worked with retail stores, wholesale, live food breeding projects, venomous collections, and a couple of zoos and things like that. And so, yeah, it was quite a privileged position. And one of the things that happened thereafter was that the people who ran the reptile magazines, the consumer reptile magazines, they had trouble getting hold of these big players because the big players are obviously busy. So they said, "Hey, Tony, would you like to write some articles about the work that you do and the species that you're working with?" And so I said, "Yeah, let's do that." So I started writing. And from there, I kind of got a side hustle really as a journalist, which eventually turned into my main career. But for a long time, I wrote for all the big reptile magazines worldwide, and then all of the trade magazines worldwide, talking about reptiles for pet trade magazines. And it was then that I met a guy called Chris Newman. And I know that was something that we wanted to talk about, but Chris Newman used to run a magazine called The Reptilian in the UK. And as part of his job, of course, he had to write about news in the trade. And a lot of that news seemed to focus on what the animal rights people were up to. And so from there, Chris became a kind of herpetoculture advocacy figure that everybody got to know. And when I started writing about reptiles, of course, it was my turn to start writing about that. And as the Reptilian finished, I kind of took over writing about those topics. So it essentially became my job to keep my finger on the pulse of what was happening with the animal rights groups. I worked closely with Chris Newman and the work that he did thereafter. And so that's how I came to be this kind of transition really from being a full-blown keeper to doing the work that we do now. It's a long, slow 35-year process, but here we are.
So your career as a journalist, was it always focused in the exotic and reptile space, or were you doing other reporting as well?
Yeah, other reporting. It really happened that I had a motorbike accident, which meant that I could no longer kind of do an active job that I was doing before. So I was like, okay, what can I do while I sit in a wheelchair or stumble around the house on crutches? What can I do for a living? And I was like, okay, so I'll be a professional writer. That was my only option, really. And so then by then I was living on a narrowboat. You can see we're on a narrowboat at the moment. That's where we live. That's where our office is. So I write for the ultra nerdy narrowboat world. I also write about ultra nerdy reptiles and write about a lot of other topics too. But most of our work over the last 15, maybe 20 years has been writing for visitor attractions. So, you go to a museum, you see something in a cabinet, you don't know what it is, so you read the blurb on the panel.
Yeah.
Well, we write all the blurb, and we write the guidebooks, and we produce little videos and things like that. And that work has actually informed, very strongly informed, the work that we do now with responsible reptile keeping. So I'm sure we'll come back to that. But the skills we developed to do that work well for visitor attractions translate very well into making sure that the work we do for responsible reptile keeping does its job too.
Yeah, that makes sense. As you were explaining that, I'm like, oh, I bet a lot of those skills translate directly, just learning to produce content.
Oh, goodness, I can't tell you.
Yeah, and like, keep attention and whatnot. So I'm kind of curious, like, we've had, we'll get into the animal rights stuff in a second, but if anybody that's in the hobby knows how much of an impact that's starting to have, we're starting to have more eyes on us and whatnot.
Yeah.
From you, when you were, 15, 16, is there like when you think back on the hobby back then, is there a part of you that's trying to bring it back to a time where it was almost simpler? Like, obviously we've come a long way in husbandry. We've done a lot of things that are a lot better for the animals. We're doing less wild caught importation, all these things that, the bad things that we do, we're getting better. But there was this really almost like, it kind of feels like a golden era of herpetoculture back, 20, 30 years ago, where people were very engaged in the scientific method, the biology side, and just enjoying it. So as far as you're concerned, is that you kind of feel yourself sort of trying to pull it back to that as your early experiences?
Oh, no, I don't think so. That's something I should just mention quickly is I mentioned we live on a narrowboat, and I don't know how much is being picked up, but it's raining here now. The narrowboat's made out of steel, so there's kind of a drumming noise. I'm hoping that's not coming through in the background too much.
No, I can't hear it at all. No.
Hey, that's great news. Let's forget about that then. But yeah, I often talk to some of the guys who were my mentors back in the day, and we often reminisce back to the good old days when we had it great, where we could kind of do what we wanted, and everything was available, and there were no great pushes for banning what we do, and there was no we were kind of underground. Nobody knew we existed, and we didn't make the news very much, and there was the hobby just wasn't even anywhere near as big as it is today. There were a few nerdy anorak guys like us meeting in the back room of some pub to have a herpetological society meeting, but we could do what we liked, and we that was the golden era as far as we were concerned. But I'm actually I'm ghostwriting an autobiography for one of my mentors, where we look back at the state of husbandry and how well and how badly we were able to keep animals back then. And we both have mixed feelings about it. The first thing is that there were so many species coming through that were brand new. They'd never been kept before. They'd never been imported. No one had ever kept them. And so by default and unavoidably, we were forced to learn hands-on. An animal would come in, we would have no idea how to keep it, and we would do our best to guess. And this was before the internet came out, where I could kind of type questions into the internet, And so by default, there were animals that we weren't able to keep very well. But the other side of that was we were able to learn. And every reptile keeper today owes a debt of thanks to those keepers who spent their own time and their own money learning how to keep these species. So yeah. And it was around about the 90s when reptile keeping was becoming popular that we started to get some trouble from animal rights groups. We'd kind of put our head above the parapet somewhat and got on the radar, and that was when we started having trouble. And it was really Chris who opened my eyes to the kind of problems that we were having and the situations that we were facing. So Chris Newman really is the reason I'm here today, and he's also probably the reason why we still have a hobby and a trade in the UK and most of Europe, at least.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about that. When you said in the 90s, the animal rights group started kind of popping in, what was that early experience like? How did you know, how did you become aware of that, and what were they up to as far as, trying to damage the hobby or stop the hobby?
Well, to be quite honest, in the 90s, I had no idea. I was as sheltered and as obsessed with my hobby as most keepers are today. And the political landscape just didn't register on my Richter scale at all. And that's how most hobbyists and keepers operate today. And that's quite understandable. They're interested in their animal, and that was all I was interested in. And throughout the 90s, I had no idea of the work that Chris Newman was doing. But what was actually happening was that the reptile shows in the UK were being attacked by the animal rights groups who were doing their best to close them down. And that really, I think, was how it began in the UK. Reptile shows came under scrutiny. And to be honest, the scrutiny that they were getting and the types of problems that they were experiencing back then were so unfair and so ridiculous and so one-sided were the arguments that I'm surprised it wasn't bigger news. And I was surprised when I look back and when I found out what was happening, I was like, my goodness, why didn't we all just stand up and do something about that? So it was so ridiculous.
So do you mean that what the reptile keepers were doing was so ridiculous and that was bad, or
No,
or what
the
they
animal
are?
rights campaigners were doing.
So what were they doing?
Oh, it's a good story. So back in the 60s, 70s and early 80s, there used to be a big market in London, an outdoor street market in London, and you could buy anything. You could buy a tiger, you could buy a chimp, you could buy, a giant tortoise, you could buy anything. And these cages were just piled up on top of each other in the center of London, in the rain and the snow and whatever else was happening. Any reptile you liked, you could buy there. And of course, that was abhorrent. It was terrible. And a law was passed that said you are not allowed to trade animals from a market stall. So if you have a market stall, you cannot sell animals from a market stall. So then if we fast forward 10, 12, 15 years or whatever, the animal rights people went to court to say that reptile shows were running a market stall and selling animals. Now, we know that a reptile show is very, very different from the situation in London in the 60s and 70s. It's run by enthusiasts who are passionate about their animals, and the animals are only there temporarily, and they're well kept, and they're of a species and families that are okay in the conditions that they're in, especially short term. And there is no comparison. But that law was used disingenuously to put a stop to reptile shows. And many of the reptile shows that were happening in those days just closed down. And we still have similar problems today. The big reptile show in Doncaster, run by the International Herpetoculture Society, has had to move from its venue because of the pressure that animal rights groups put on the venue, and the venue wouldn't host us anymore. And now we're exhibiting at another venue halfway down the country. And it's disingenuous and it's unfair and it's impractical. But that's what's happening. That's the kind of laws and that's the kind of pressure we're facing.
And that's, it always seems like the AR groups have such a large amount of money that it's very easy for them to manipulate might be too strong of a word, but in some ways it is manipulation. They can manipulate public officials because they can come in with a one-sided story, and then if we aren't as organized as we ought to be, then they can run with that really quickly. And it would be easy to convince someone, hey, they're setting up in a gymnasium with all these animals is basically a market. We shouldn't be allowed to do that. And if the reptile keepers aren't allowed to respond to that, then it could easily get shut down. So I guess Chris must be going back and forth for 15, 20 years through the 90s and the early 2000s with these people. How was he ever having to?
Oh man, yeah.
What sort of things was he having to do in order to try to block those animal rights, claims?
Well, the first thing is that Chris, when he started, had no experience of dealing with this stuff. And to my knowledge, Chris just started making a lot of noise and forcing his way into the meetings that were happening where these decisions were being made and where legislation was being discussed. And he basically strong-armed his way in there to be part of the discussion, because it's ridiculous. If you're going to pass a law about reptiles and how they should be kept and where they should be kept and what should happen, surely reptile keepers and reptile specialists should be around that table. And if they're not around the table, then we have a problem. And your guy, Phil Goss at USR put it very well indeed when he said that legislation is created by the people who show up. Yeah. And so in the UK, Chris was the first person to be showing up. And in his efforts to protect the trade and protect the hobby that he felt so passionate about, his magazine failed, and then his business failed, and he basically spent all of his money fighting the animal rights groups and representing for the reptile trade. And it reached the point where he could no longer do this, of course, because everybody needs to pay the bills. And so thankfully, the UK's reptile trade, there are two big wholesalers in the UK. There used to be three. So British Herpetoculture Supply, Eurorep, used to be one of them, but they don't exist anymore. I think they got bought out. And now the two big reptile wholesalers in the UK, Peregrine Live Food and Monkfield Nutrition, those are the two organisations that took up the funding to provide funding for Chris. And the organisation he formed was called the Reptile and Exotic Pet Trade Association. And as a result, we became pretty well supported and pretty well established on the political scene in the UK. However, we do still suffer from, and have done for decades, still suffer from the same problems we always suffer from, that puts us on the back foot when compared with animal rights groups. We're poorly funded, we're poorly organised. We don't have the same level of support that the animal rights groups are able to muster, because their approach is usually quite disingenuous. They say that they play on the heartstrings of their supporters, and they gather funds from those supporters. I think World Animal Protection brought in, the last time I looked, £32 million in a year. Wow. You know, we just simply don't have those funds to play with. They're well organised, they're well funded, and they're well supported, and they're around every table, usually 3, 4, 5 or more organisations at a time, explaining their side of the story. And apart from people like Chris and a handful of others, we simply weren't there.
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier for the animal rights groups to appeal to a wider audience. Obviously, we're dealing with a niche group of people who have a very unusual, hobby, and you could make an emotional appeal to people. Most people are going to say, yeah, maybe you shouldn't keep snakes. So it's kind of an easy sales pitch for those people.
Oh, it is.
There's also that, for us, we kind of have to have that balance between making sure that we're defending the hobby and the privilege to keep these animals in captivity, but also in some ways we don't want to defend just for the sake of defending, right? Because then we get into this, and I see that a lot of times in the States as well, where we just like, I get to keep these animals no matter what, and then you throw out husbandry, you throw out any ethics of keeping, and it just becomes this, I want to keep a snake, so I get to keep a snake. And so we have to kind of strike that balance between saying, yeah, we should earn this privilege to do it, but it's not just to fight to have the right to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But this is exactly why we made the organisation's name Responsible Reptile Keeping, because neither you, I, Chris Newman, Phil Goss, or any other advocate for the hobby and the trade wants to stand behind poor keepers. We don't want to represent them. We don't want to support them. We don't want to perpetuate them. In fact, what we want to do is absolutely the opposite. Now, luckily, however way you look at the reptile hobby and trade, whichever way you measure it, whichever data evidence you have, the reptile hobby has better welfare than most other pets. There isn't an enormous reptile welfare crisis within the hobby or the trade. Yes, there are bad actors. Yes, there are problems. And yes, we want to be doing something about that. But certainly there is a much bigger movement of people who want to do the best, who want to keep them well. And that goes for businesses as well. I think that businesses and stores especially get such a bad rap, simply because they make a living from it. These are passionate people who want their animals to be well looked after and want their customers to be happy. And if they don't do a good job, hey, they go out of business real quick, So, I like to sing the praises of the reptile trade, which has come on leaps and bounds in the last 20 years. It's unrecognizable. So, yeah, I'll stick that flag in the sand and say thank you to those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we talk a little bit about Warwick or Clifford? Is it Clifford is his first name, I think?
Warwick.
Warwick, yeah. So this is somebody that I've come across. I mean, everybody has come across him at some point. I mean, even me years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, naively even cited some of his work because he's written some papers that are, have to do with animal welfare, and they sort of fall into the whatever it was. I kind of forget what the paper was, and it wasn't from my memory, I don't remember it standing out as an animal rights piece. It was more about, I think it was like snake behavior, or snake stretching out or whatnot. But anyway, he's a kind of a sneaky character, so some people have heard his name before. Can you kind of give us a background about who he is?
I kind of can, but I have to admit that I've never met the guy. He pretty much refuses to integrate or to debate or to have anything to do with representatives from the trade. So he's a little bit mysterious in that respect. So some of what I know about him is anecdotal, but I'm confident enough about the sources that have explained this to me to give it a go. So Clifford Warwick was an importer and trader of reptiles in the 70s. And according to all accounts, even by the standards of the day, which were pretty bad, Clifford Warwick was abhorrent. He was very bad indeed at keeping reptiles. And apparently everything that he kept died. So that's the first thing. That was when he first came onto the radar. But then he seemed to switch camps and go over to the animal rights side and start campaigning that maybe because if he couldn't keep animals, then animals can't be kept or shouldn't be kept. And he's put, to the untrained eye, he might seem convincing. The papers that he writes look like scientifically credible evidence, but it doesn't take much investigation. It doesn't take much scrutiny to realize that they're not very robust at all. Mm-hmm. And his approach to creating science seems to be, this is what I believe. Let me create or find some evidence to support it. It doesn't seem to be balanced. And that's not good science, of course. We know that he's not entirely credible. He was often cited and claimed to be a doctor, to have a doctorate for many years when he didn't. We haven't been able to trace the academic organizations, institutions where he apparently got his credentials. And there's a lot about him that just simply doesn't add up. He claims to have been trained by the SAS, which is the UK Secret Service, very much like your Navy SEALs and special forces groups. How true that is, I don't know. But he was also asked to present his proof of his credentials to Parliament at one point, and either couldn't, wouldn't, or just didn't. So there's a lot to be skeptical about Clifford Warwick for. We've attempted to invite him for debate on several occasions, and is always, to my knowledge, refused. And so, yeah, what can we say? The papers that he writes are often supposedly peer reviewed, but you'll always see the same names in the peer review section. It's always Philip Arena and Christina Stedman and a handful of other of the usual suspects that are hardcore animal rights advocates, and they pass their own papers around each other and peer review them. So, that looks like, as far as I'm aware, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Mm-hmm. And it looks like a duck to me.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is that these animal rights groups do have a tremendous amount of funding, like we already spoke about, and they are willing to, because it's a very aggressive ideology, right? Many of them are, vegetarians or vegans mostly, and I, not passing judgment on the way someone eats, but a lot of times these animal rights groups have a very aggressive ideology that they are really wanting others to bind onto. Yeah, it's very deep, and they are willing to do things that aren't necessarily, ethical in an ironic way in order to get their message across. So it can be kind of difficult, and like we already mentioned, they could cherry pick things that we are doing that aren't good, and that's why we need to do, like, as you said, the responsible keeping piece is we need to make sure that we're cleaning up everything possible so they have less ammunition to pull from. And you'd mentioned to me off air is that they really have sort of four areas that they mainly attack the hobby from.
Yeah.
Can you run through those?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the first one is welfare. They claim that reptiles are difficult or impossible to keep, and that there's countless examples, of them being kept badly. And that's simply not true. Objectively, we have never been able to find any evidence that tells us that there is a significant welfare issue with reptiles that would put it any worse than cat, dog, rabbit, budgie, parrot keeping. Reptiles are amongst the best kept animals as far as we can tell by the evidence that we have. A few years ago, the number of reptiles kept in the UK was the same or greater than the number of dogs, but rescued and rehomed dogs outnumbered rescued and rehomed reptiles 20-1.
Wow.
So that tells us a little bit about, if there's the same number of dogs and reptiles, more or less, why do dogs outnumber reptiles in rehoming centres 20-1? That's just one bit of evidence that we have. Welfare is the first one thing that they attack us for. The second thing they attack us for is human health issues. So this might be, the guy next door keeps cobras or giant pythons and they're all going to kill your children and swallow your grandmother, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that rarely, if ever, happens. Or the other side of the coin is zoonotic diseases. So the big one is salmonella. Before that, do you remember back to the COVID era?
Yes.
When we were all going to get some kind of terrible zoonotic disease from our animals. It was supposed to be a vector for the end of humankind. COVID was just the beginning, and you could catch something from your leopard gecko or whatever that would wipe out humanity. So that was a big thing for a while.
Yeah.
But the big push for human health is salmonella. They claim that salmonella is a massive issue. If you look at the zoonotic diseases that you can get from reptiles, they're few and far between, and washing your hands will keep you safe.
Mm.
Yeah. Whereas with cats, man, there's some serious stuff that you can get from cats.
Yeah, and some stuff you cannot get rid of. Like there's that weird parasite or whatever it is that you can. I forget if it's a parasite or a toxin, whatever it is. But yeah, you can get stuff from your cats that you can never rid yourself of.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's not really a big problem, but it gets touted as the reason why we shouldn't keep reptiles. And there was even I don't think you have it in the USA. We have a legislative thing called no win, no fee. So if you have a problem, a lawyer will take on your case for free, and you won't get charged from them unless they win the case. Mm. So the animal rights groups set up a no win, no fee campaign for anybody who'd been to a reptile show and caught salmonella. So you could go along and get a lawyer to represent you for free, and as long as they win their case, they get paid. Do you know how many people took up that campaign to try and get money because they caught salmonella?
No. How many?
Zero.
Mm.
Zero. So that kind of gives us another benchmark that we can work with. If you're going to catch salmonella, it's probably because you didn't, look after your fridge well enough and ate some chicken you weren't supposed to, or didn't wash your hands because of something. So we started with welfare as the first one. Then we went on to human health, which was the second one. The third one is invasive species. And this is usually it's one of the things that they were arguing about reptile shows for, the fact that we were bringing in so many reptiles into this one concentrated place in the UK, the reptile show, and then they were all going to become invasive. And they used an example of Dendrobates, the poison frogs, and said that they might become invasive in Doncaster, which is in the north of England, one of the coldest, wettest, most Englandish of English places that you could expect Dendrobates to live, poison frogs to live. It was so ridiculous, but to the untrained eye, that might seem like a good argument. But yeah, invasive species risks is one of the issues that we get faced with regularly. And you can imagine that in the UK, that risk is minuscule, if indeed it could possibly exist.
Right.
So there you go. There's invasive species. And the last one is conservation. Apparently, we tear so many reptiles from the wild that we're destroying populations in the wild. when you compare how many animals we bring in from the wild now compared with those that are captive bred, again, that's a non-argument. And if we really wanted to protect reptiles and other species in the wild, firstly, we'd be examining the cat issue again. And cats kill so many millions upon millions of birds and frogs and fish and reptiles and et cetera, that, maybe cats are a bigger issue than the pet trade. And also the number of reptiles that are killed and skinned for their skins.
Yeah.
That's a much bigger issue. And none of the ones that get caught for the skin trade are kept alive.
Yeah.
So, again, conservation, it's a really disingenuous argument. And this is why I feel so incredulous about it. This is why I feel that the animal rights approach is just an ideology. They have very strong, very extreme views. There's relatively few of them, but they make a lot of noise. And you might have seen the end of our last video where it's basically a few very vocal, very angry people make a lot of noise that creates laws that force the rest of us to do stuff that isn't fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think, because they have such an extreme view and they're sort of in some ways blinded by that aggressive ideology, the question I would always ask an animal rights person is, if we were to remove herpetoculture completely, what are we getting rid of? And I don't even think they could define what they're getting rid of. The only thing that they can think of is you're getting rid of an animal in an enclosure in somebody's house. But okay, how about all the captive breeding that people have done over the years? How about all the education and outreach that we do all the time? How about the fact that we do actually have preservation and raise money for conservation and all these other things that are all connected to herpetoculture that I'm not even sure an animal rights person is even aware of, because they have the blinders on so aggressively that they just have this one goal to get the snake out of your house. But we don't know how many vets became interested in reptiles because of an experience they had as a kid. And, it cascades over and over again. And thinking about the wild population of dendrobates up in northern UK makes me remember this. A couple years ago, we had an issue where there was this proposal for a positive list, and we can maybe talk about positive lists at some point. And I remember looking at the list, and the species on this list were so out of left field, I could not believe it. Like, some of them were Australian that aren't even in captive population at all, so which means
that's
to get them,
a common occurrence.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. My theory was this list was so bizarre that either it was put together by someone who has no idea what they're doing, or it's by somebody who is cunning enough to know that the species on this positive list would be virtually impossible for anybody to get, and therefore by making a positive list, they're essentially making a non-list at all. Is it either of those things, or in your experience, do you know, is it often people just are so ignorant that they're creating laws with no information, or do they actually know what they're doing?
Take your pick.
Mm-hmm.
Take your pick. I don't think there's much way to discern between the two often, but I can give you an example of a Clifford Warwick example, and I can give you an example from Norway. So Clifford Warwick developed a supposed way of assessing how difficult different types of animal were to keep, and it wasn't just reptiles; it was across the board. So the system is called E-mode. And it's easy, medium, or difficult was the attribution it gave. Have a guess how many reptiles were easy? None. No reptiles are easy to keep. None.
Yeah, okay.
And I think even corn snakes and bearded dragons were put down as difficult to keep.
Wow.
So yeah, I think that comes under one of your guesses. Is it people who don't know what they're talking about, or is it people who do know what they're talking about and do know what they're doing? I think in Clifford Warwick's case, it was the case that they do know what they're talking about, and he did know what he was doing. So that's that. But the example from Norway is interesting. So in Norway, reptiles were just banned outright from being kept from 1977 to 2017, just an outright ban. So in that time, the government conducted a study, and part of that study estimated that there were about 110,000 reptiles being kept in Norway at that time, because people will invariably just ignore the ban that they don't feel is fair.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And then they go underground, and then they can't go to the vet, and they can't ask for expert advice. So that's not particularly good for welfare, is it? If you force people to go underground. But anyway, 110,000 reptiles being kept in Norway. There was even a thriving commercial sector selling live food and equipment to these underground reptile keepers in Norway, and we had a talk at one of the society meetings in the UK from a reptile refugee who had to leave Norway and go, I think, to Sweden so that he could keep his animals. So that was in place from 77 to 2017. And then the campaigning that was underway by a guy called Svein Fossa, if I remember rightly. Fantastic guy. I interviewed him recently. He's a font of knowledge. And him and some of his colleagues were campaigning to get this ban overturned. And one of the things that was being put on the table as a solution that Sven, I understand, campaigned heavily against was a positive list. However, at the same time, there were a handful of keepers who decided that a positive list was the best that they could hope for, and campaigned with the government to produce a positive list. The species that appeared on the positive list were, by some coincidence, exactly the same species that were being kept by the people who were helping the government to produce a positive list. So the random, nerdy, left field, nobody, these hardcore keepers weren't keeping leopard geckos, bearded dragons, corn snakes, because, when you've been doing it a few years, you probably want something a little bit more. Interest is not the right word, but you get my point.
Yeah.
I do love a good beardy, beardies are interesting enough. But anyway, but these weren't the species that these guys were keeping. So they were like, oh, we'll produce a positive list then. Can you put my species on there? And this other, species that I've got. So that's how that positive list came about. If you asked me to predict which species would be on a positive list and which species wouldn't, I got nothing for you. I got nothing. You may as well throw darts at a dartboard.
It's just totally random. Yeah, and it's funny. It's like, oh, just by chance, all the things that are on the positive list I actually have in my basement. It's just the way it goes. And I guess maybe I should have defined positive. I think most people probably are aware, but for those who don't know what a positive list is, that's essentially just a list of species that the government has decided that you are allowed to keep. And depending on where you are, you may already exist in a place with a positive list, but obviously, there's so many issues with that. Who's going to make the list? The first one. Who's going to police the list? That's a pretty big issue.
Police the list.
Exactly, because especially a lot of government officials don't know what they're looking at, and then you get into issues with new like speciations where you have a new description of a species, or you're splitting a species, and then it's like, what does that even mean? So it becomes a nightmare. And I think maybe you could touch a little bit on what happened in Spain, because I know that this is an example of how far things can get, and I forget if it's a positives list they have there, or what's the situation.
Oh, I'd better start that story from the beginning, because it staggers me every time I tell this story. It's just unbelievable. And I've done a few talks recently to different audiences. And one of the first things I say when I get in front of those audiences is, I've seen the future. Yeah. And that's shocking. It sounds, okay, you've seen the future. Tell me. That's quite a statement. So in Spain in 2016, somebody took note of the number of ball pythons that were being imported into Spain, decided this was interesting, incredulous, problematic, and they conducted a risk assessment to ascertain whether or not ball pythons could become invasive in Spain. Now, we all know that Spain and West Africa are very, very different places with very, very different environments, and the odds on ball pythons becoming invasive in Spain is nil, zero, nothing. Yeah. So everybody who read this risk assessment came to the same conclusion, that it was ridiculous, poorly formulated, bad science, not worth listening to, and they put it in a drawer and they forgot about it for a few years. Then, I think it was 2019, an eco-activist came to a position of some power, of civil servant power in Spain, unearthed this risk assessment and decided that it was justification enough to enact a ban on ball pythons. Oh, and at the same time, we should also mention that it wasn't just ball pythons, it was Savannah boss monitors and Peninsula cooters as well. They were all just banned overnight. That was it. Gone.
Another kind of random array of species as well.
A little, but I think they're all imported together.
Oh, okay.
Which I think is why they ended up on the same list. But you go again, who's going to, if I asked you to guess, okay, ban 3 species in Spain, take your pick. Who comes up with those 3?
Exactly.
But anyway, there they were, banned. Now, can you imagine what it would be like if ball pythons were banned in the USA?
No.
Or in the UK? Can you imagine what it would be like? I can't even begin. But anyway, that's what happened. So there's a gentleman that I've been in touch with. We interviewed him in one of our interviews. He's a guy called Jose. In fact, he's got the most Spanish name I've ever heard in my life, Jose Lopez Sanchez. And the guy is fantastic. He's awesome. He's so knowledgeable. And he's the president of the Valencia Herpetological Society, which is the biggest herpetological society in Spain. And they were so incredulous with the ban that they decided to campaign against the ban. And they managed to recruit enough support and enough funding to take the law to court, to their high court. So they went to court and they turned up with some expert witnesses, with some really robust science. It should have been an open goal, really, because their evidence was so convincing. But this all happened at about the same time as lockdown, and a few things went wrong. The first one was that the Spanish legal system was in such disarray over lockdown, they just wanted everything done quickly. And as far as Jose was concerned, the judge had already decided where he was going to go with the case and just wanted it to be over and done with. The second thing that happened was that Jose believes that if they'd had more information and more content that was easy to digest and easily read, then they could have swayed the judge somewhat. But the third thing that happened was the judge was apparently of the opinion that if our civil servant, if this expert, if this conservation-minded individual, if these animal rights groups are campaigning so ardently for this topic, then it must be true. And so at the end of the court case, he said, I've heard what you have to say. I understand what you have to say, but we're going to keep the ban anyway. So facts didn't help us. Right. Science didn't help us. It was the amount of noise being created from our opposition that flipped the chart. And not only did they lose the case, they also had to get another 12,000 euros, I think it was, to pay for the other side's legal fees. Oh. So that was great. In the meantime, at the same time, the Spanish government basically destroyed the CITES regulatory offices in Spain. I think there were approximately 30 or so across Spain, and they reduced it to 1. All the CITES officers were sent off to do other jobs, and young animal rights activists were recruited to implement and look after CITES. So this was about the time when reptile keepers all over Spain were being raided. And it wasn't just reptile keepers. I know of one parrot keeper who had a collection of parrots that were all legally owned and kept. And he had created a breeding project at his facility, bringing in animals from around the country so that he could look after this breeding project. The guy was quite elderly and a little bit disabled. And when the raids were going on across Spain, him and his wife were raided, door kicked open, thrown to the floor, handcuffed. Birds were taken, and those birds are dead now. Someone else I know had all of his animals taken. They were distributed to government-approved collections around the country, and a lot of those are dead now. And raids were happening all over the country. Legitimate keepers who'd been doing what they thought was best and doing things that the CITES department of old had approved of previously. Now, suddenly, the laws that you thought you were compliant with yesterday, we don't interpret those laws like that anymore. We interpret them differently. And now you're illegal. Now you're raided. Now you're in handcuffs.
Yeah. So now you're a criminal. Yeah.
And your animals are seized. All of your animals, they're gone. And wow. You're probably not going to see them again. And
so
a friend of mine...
Before I let you go into that story, when the ban of ball pythons was instituted, was it a ban on all the animals that already existed? Or were the animals that were in collections supposed to be grandfathered in? Or was it an expectation that we were going to come pull animals?
I think they were grandfathered in, but what it did was all the people with ball python breeding projects, what use are they?
Right.
What use were those collections then? So, and to be honest, they one of the laws said that you had to register your ball pythons, and so Jose did a freedom of information request to his local Valencian authorities, and so he told me that in Valencia, the number of people who registered their ball pythons was 7. 7 people registered. Because what would you do? Hey, you need to tell us that you've got illegal animals. Everybody's like, no, you're never
exactly.
going to find them.
I'm not gonna fall for that trick.
Yeah, Jose says you can still buy ball pythons. Of course, they're not being offered for sale online, and they're not being offered for sale at stores. But you can still breed and keep ball pythons. And this is the thing about unfair laws: people don't listen to unfair laws. People don't listen when they don't think the law is doing a good job. Here in the UK, we have what's called the Dangerous Wild Animals Act.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a lot of animals that could potentially cause harm, all the venomous stuff, all the crocodiles, big cats, things that could cause harm. And it's a reasonably good idea that if you want to keep these animals, you should prove your competency. And most importantly, you should prove that you keeping these animals won't cause harm to your neighbors or to members of the general public. Do you know, if you want to keep cobras and you get bitten, it's a shame, but you knew what you would do and you signed up for it. If your neighbor gets bitten, that's not fair. Your neighbor shouldn't have to, run that risk because they didn't sign up for it. Reasonably good idea. However, the local authorities in the UK administer the Dangerous Wild Animals Act in very different ways. Some of them say, hey, yeah, show us that you've got some, reasonable safety mechanisms in place. Your license is going to cost you 70 quid or something. There you go. Others say, right, we want this isn't true, but you get my point. Laser operated doors that are escape proof, double doors, twin locks, Oh, and by the way, your license is going to cost you £3,500.
Right.
So when you're faced with an unfair administrative load like that, guess what happens? People don't apply for a Dangerous Wild Animals license. There was a report that said that only 10% of venomous keepers in the UK actually have a license. Personally, I think that's generous, So unfair laws just get ignored, which is why white lists, positive lists simply won't work. But coming back to Spain, those keepers who had their animals taken, we can all empathize, sympathize with those people. If somebody came along and took your animals, I can guess how you'd feel. You'd be sad, you'd be outraged. But it gets worse than that still. Spain have just implemented positive lists, white lists for everything, not just reptiles, for birds, for mammals, for amphibians, for fish. Everything is covered now by a positive list. And if your reptile is over 2 kilograms, that's banned. You can't keep a reptile over 2 kilograms. You can't keep anything that's covered by CITES. The only reptile over 2 kilograms you can keep, my apologies, are chelonians. So I can only assume that this 2 kilogram thing is something to do with how dangerous it is. But, a snapping turtle, you're okay there.
Yeah.
Because it's a chelonian. So very poorly thought out. Even things such as if you breed your dog and you're not a registered dog breeder, then you can be fined €10,000. There's so much bad legislation out there in Spain at the moment, and many European countries are looking to Spain for examples. They're looking very much like they're doing with the traveling education legislation in the USA. Different states are looking to cookie cutter that legislation into their state, and that's what's happening in the UK as well. And so much bad legislation is coming through Spain at the moment that nobody knows how it's going to be unraveled. They're hoping for a new political party in Spain soon, and they're confident and being confirmed that new party will overturn some of those laws. But it's more difficult to overturn laws than it is to stop them happening in the first place. And so I think Spain is going to be a problem for a long time. My friend in Spain, he's leaving. He's a reptile refugee.
Wow. Yeah, and it's
indeed
this culture of outrage politics, and it's kind of how you had said, they're able to skew the judge just because it's almost like the politicians are in some ways scared to go against the people that are screaming with their signs and throwing fake blood on things. It's like we see that all over the place, not just in reptiles, all over. There's these weird laws coming in and weird rules and regulations, and it's because there's a very small group of people who are shrieking outside that everybody's suddenly afraid of.
But at the other end of the scale, we also have to take some responsibility as reptile keepers, reptile hobbyists, reptile trade. We have to take some responsibility, because the animal rights fraternity have always been very good at this. Mm-hmm. They essentially have control of the narrative. And this is especially true on social media. And this, I think, has been the big shift in power since the social media and the internet became a thing. So previously, what would happen was some ridiculous legislation would be proposed by animal rights campaigners, and then advocacy organizations, Chris Newman and any of the other ones, would come along and say, hey, hold on a minute. We're the specialists. We know what we're talking about. This isn't accurate. This isn't correct. This isn't fair or proportionate. Maybe we should have a discussion to create fairer legislation. And this is true whether the legislation is fair or is unfair. One thing I know about Chris is he's never campaigned for bad process. He's always maintained that if there is a problem, then we should be part of the solution. Mm-hmm. But largely what these organizations did was they were firefighting superheroes. So problematic legislation would come along. Chris or his colleagues would put their underpants on the outside and put a cape on and fly in to save the day. And they did a great job at that, and they still do a great job at that. It's an essential part of the process. And if you support these organizations, continue to support them and support them some more, because without these people, we would be in a lot of trouble. With that said, there's a missing piece of the puzzle. And this is where the animal rights fraternity, the animal rights groups have been able to get the better of us. Because there's no getting away from the fact that compared with the 80s and the 90s, today's reptile hobby is far advanced. Husbandry and care and welfare is vastly higher. So if we're so much better at keeping reptiles, and if we've got support from these organizations who look after our interest, why are we having more problems now than ever before? How can that be? And I think we have the answer. And the answer is social media. So the animal rights groups are very, very good at social media. That's how they've gained so much funding, so much support, and so much power. By comparison, the reptile trade and hobby, we haven't been very good at that at all.
No.
If you're looking for big views on social media, that's probably not the image that we want to be putting across. You know, the bad keepers that are getting bitten, or feeding videos that are horrific for the average person to watch. These kind of things is seemingly the main face of the reptile keeping world. We know that it's a tiny proportion. We know that most reptile keepers are far more welfare conscious, far more effective at keeping than previously. But we don't have control of the narrative. So if we know that social media is how people get their opinions, how people get their ideologies, where people get their information from, if we know that the animal rights groups are bombarding the average person with the narrative and the information and the misinformation and propaganda that they want to broadcast, who's looking after us? Who's telling our side of the story? Well, I think the answer is very few people, if any.
Yeah.
So then we start to look at who should be telling our side of the story, because every time we see stuff like this online, every time we see that, I think we discussed the 75% of pet reptile statistic. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
So there's been this statistic online: 75% of pet reptiles die in their first year. Now, you and I as reptile keepers look at that statistic and go, really? That can't be true. How can that be true? We know that in our hearts it can't be true. But that statistic's been out there for decades, running wild on the internet, being shared on social media, like an invasive species running around and causing destruction in its path. But we know it's not true. We even have research that tells us it's not true. We have 2 scientific studies from the UK. One of them came out with a statistic that says 3.25%, I think it is. Forgive my statistics for being slightly wrong if they are. And the other one says 3.75, I'm guessing, but it was a long way from 75%. Independent, different methodology studies. So why aren't we making those statistics available? Why aren't we, every time that 75% thing comes up online, why isn't somebody doing something about it? Because the cry goes up. Somebody should do something. Somebody should write an article, write to the newspapers. Somebody should do something. Why isn't anybody doing anything? And this was the position that we found ourselves in. So let's look at who should do something. So the people with the biggest vested interest in protecting the trade and protecting the hobby and making sure our message is heard, the people with the biggest vested interest are the businesses that make money, and most notably the big businesses that make money from the reptile trade.
Yeah.
So why don't they do something about it? Well, there's a good answer, and quite an understandable answer, which is the people who run businesses are busy running their businesses. They can't be expected to be online looking for information on the internet to respond to and taking up the mantle and employing people to fight a battle that everybody should be fighting. So they're busy running their businesses. That's what they do. So the other people who could do that, maybe it's the advocacy organizations that are at the front line fighting legislation. Well, maybe they could, but to be honest, they're probably not funded enough. They're busy fighting the fight at the front line, and they probably don't have the skills in order to do it as well. So that's why they don't do it. So maybe it should fall to the keepers to fight that fight for us. Every time they see something online, maybe keepers should be fighting against it and coming back with facts and information and science. Well, I'm sure they would, but there are reasons why that doesn't happen either. Firstly, most keepers are busy with their lives. They have kids to take to football practice, elderly parents, jobs to go and earn a living. So that's the first thing. But even the ones who can find time to do it don't have the resources, probably don't have the communication skills to do so. Mm-hmm. So that's where we came in. We took to bolt in our expertise onto the side of the advocacy organizations for many years, trying to help them to communicate. And we failed at this. And the reason we failed at doing this is because while we were helping the advocacy organizations do their communications work, our day job business with the visitor attractions was suffering. So when we changed our focus to work on our day job to earn a living, we weren't working with the advocacy organizations. And this is something that bent my brain for years. And I've been talking for years that we ought to do something about this. And it got to the point about a year ago where I was talking to my wife about this subject again and going over what we may be able to do about it again. And she sat me down and she said, "Tony, you've been talking about this for a long time. It's time to stop talking and start doing." And so that's what we did. We put Responsible Reptile Keeper together as a way to address these issues that are causing us so many problems on social media, so many problems because we don't have control of the narrative. And we did our best to organize it in such a way that the organization could be effective and robust. And there's a lot of workings behind the scenes to make that happen. But yeah, that's why we did what we did. I can't believe I spoke for so long about that topic, but you can tell that I'm pretty passionate and ranty about it, I'm afraid.
No, that's perfect. I mean, and that was the thing when I first stumbled across it, the responsible reptile keeping. It was kind of like it came out of nowhere, and the first videos that I saw were so well done that it seemed like, I'm like, who is this? Like, who's making these videos? Because it just seemed very professional, and it is the response that we need. Because you're so right. I mean, not only are reptile, it would be almost more beneficial if reptile keepers were not on social media. So it's not only that we're just a neutral,
sometimes,
we actually cause a lot of damage in some ways just because of the amount of, like you said, there's the flashy, getting bit, feeding off live animals, all these different things that we don't want it's a part of keeping. But it's not the most exciting part of keeping. It's not why we do it. Most people aren't interested in feeding off live animals to their animals. It's just part of the thing. But it's what the PETAs and WAP or what Animal World or whatever they're called, Animal Protection.
World Animal Protection,
World Animal Protection. They'll cling on to, and that's their poster for against us. And we need somebody to give us a more professional message that does, hey, that 75% statistic is so far off, it's not even funny. I mean, half the reptiles we keep, you could not even feed for a year and they would still be alive. Like it's sort of amazing to think that that statistic has been floating around with so much vigor.
Google it right now. Anybody who's watching this, just open a tab and Google it and see what you get. And hopefully our video will come up refuting it. But imagine that video wasn't there. It's all over the internet. It's the only thing all over the internet. And you won't find Becky Clark's study saying 2.5%. You won't find Dice's study, the Durrell Institute. You won't find their study saying 3.75. My figures might be 1 or 2% out. I'm sorry, but yeah, you won't find those. All you'll see is the horse crap 75% number. It's unbelievable how pervasive that is, and that's just one example of one story that's causing a problem. There's countless.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know where they originally got that 75% from?
Oh, yeah.
How did they get that?
It's amazing. So in our video, we talk about 3 things that's wrong with that study, but there's actually countless. We had to discount a lot of the problems with that study because the video would have been too long. So the first one is they said the study was peer reviewed. Well, it wasn't. We got in touch with the editor of the publication where it was reviewed, and he told us that it wasn't a peer-reviewed study. So that's fault number 1. Fault number 2, they vastly underestimated the population of animals in the UK. So there's an organization that, a really good organization, actually. They used to be called the Pet Food Manufacturers Association, and now they're called UK Pet Food. And they do an awesome survey every year to survey how many animals are kept in the UK. And their survey methodology is really good when estimating the number of dogs and cats, but everybody pretty much accepts that the methodology doesn't work for reptiles, and there's a reason for that. They estimate that if you keep a pet, you probably keep 1.6 pets. And the way they come up with that number is that if you keep a dog, you probably just have 1 dog. Some people have 2 dogs, and very few people have more. If you keep a cat, you probably keep 1 cat. Some people have 2 cats, but very few people have more. So 1.6 works, as an average.
Right.
If you keep reptiles, you're probably keeping more than 1.6 reptiles, like fish. A lot of people who keep reptiles keep, dozens, scores, sometimes hundreds of reptiles. So 1.6 just doesn't work for reptiles. But they use that statistic, even though there are far better studies out there. They knowingly use that statistic, even though the Federation of British Herpetologists study, I think it was last year, worked out very credibly that there were 8.8 million reptiles in the UK, which is a lot different to the number that comes out of Pet Food PFMA study. But they disingenuously used that study to underrepresent the population in the UK. So that was fault number 2. Fault number 3 was they got figures from our government as to how many reptiles fly into the UK. Okay, that's a number we can use. What they didn't do is subtract the amount that flew straight out again in transit to other countries. So they overrepresented the number coming in, underrepresented the number that were alive and well living in the UK, and then came up with their 75% statistic. And it's such bad science and such incomplete assessment but who's going to know? You might have seen that study. You're going to read those 50 pages. No, everybody just reads the abstract at the end that says 75%. Then it becomes fact. Yeah,
and that's just an example of the type of manipulation that they'll do, and it's almost depressing when you start to unfold it and go, wow, there's absolutely no substance to this at all. You're basically standing on a house of cards, but for some reason it still can just carry on. It's such a good tagline. 75% of animals are dead, and that just has a life of its own, and it just carries its own. It just goes on forever, really.
And this is one of the big problems we have as a trade, is that the animal rights story is like, oh my God, big problem, dying reptiles and stolen from the wild. And it's great big headlines. Whereas our headlines are, no, not really. It's not that bad. Nothing to see here. It's not that, no big headlines for you, I'm afraid. It's just that, nothing too bad is happening.
Yeah.
And ours just doesn't make headlines. And that's the difficulty we have.
Now, would you consider eventually using responsible reptile keeping to promote some of the amazing, can we find headline worthy accomplishments within herpetoculture that could be promoted in a way, like world's first captive breeding of this species that zoos haven't been able to accomplish, but this guy in his basement who's obsessed with this genus and species was able to do, things along those lines to give us some headlines to associate with the public?
Yeah, we definitely should, and that's on our list to do. It's a very long list, as you can imagine, but the world, zoos, conservation, everyone has a lot to thank private herpetoculture for. Private herpetoculture has led the way, cut a path for herpetology. Every major advancement in herpetology has come from the private sector, and zoos often follow in our wake. They use the information that comes out of private herpetoculture. It's astounding. We often see headlines, hey, zoo bred this for the first time ever. And then we look at each other and go, hang on, we were breeding those in the 90s.
Yeah.
But it's a zoo first, and fair play to them. They do a lot of good work. And I've got a lot to say for zoos. I'm not saying that's bad. What I'm saying is that private herpetoculture is under applauded, because if you create a positive list of just a handful of animals, let's say, who's learning about these weird boids or elapids or colubrids that aren't on the positive list? Who's learning about them? It basically stops all scientific learning. If you stop private herpetologists and keepers from keeping species that they want to keep, then that stops the learning. There's my greatest example. In fact, there's two actually. One was golden mantellas, which were under threat in Madagascar due to mining and logging and the other bits and bobs of habitat destruction. So a group of private herpers paid to bring a few into America and the UK, where they were bred to satisfy the demand that was previously taking them from the wild. So that's the first thing. They stopped being taken from the wild. And secondly, the prices paid for those frogs was such that they were enabling refuge centres to be refuge parks to be set up in Madagascar to look after the few places where those animals still existed. And I'm not sure what's happening with that project now. I don't think it's good news, but that's not because we didn't try. Mm-hmm. And the second one is crested geckos. So crested geckos were thought to be extinct until 1992. Oh man, my dates are
I think around there, 92, 93. Yeah. Might have been 94, I forget. It's early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, until a gang of reptile keepers went over, found them, brought them back to the USA, bred the hell out of them, and now in the UK, they're the fourth most captive bred lizard. That's a success story.
And they're plentiful in the wild as well. That's the other thing to mention. It's not like there aren't any left on New Caledonia. There's still, you can go there and find them all over the place.
Everybody who's got a UV lamp in their enclosures should say thank you to Gary Bagnall and ZooMed for making that happen in herpetoculture. And we could go on. Tell me one good thing that's come out of herpetoculture, and I'll point at a private keeper. Our understanding of Ferguson zones. Thank you, Francis Baines. I could keep going all day. It's banning people from keeping reptiles is a bad idea, even to the point where if you only have a positive list and I can only keep these animals, maybe these animals aren't the one that's right for me. Maybe I should have been keeping this one instead. And so I'm trying to keep this one, but doing it badly because this one would have been a better animal for me. By restricting the pool of available animals, you're restricting the ability of a keeper to keep what suits them best. Oh, there's so many reasons. So many reasons.
Yeah, it does become that. I mean, it's just a classic thing that happens to governments and bureaucracy, is that there's a tendency to want to over-regulate, overrule, and create so many things that in their mind, it's, creating basically bumpers in a bowling alley that, keeping people in line, and they're going to have success at the end. But really, you just destroy the game, when you're playing bowling, for example. But you reduce the flexibility. Yeah, like you reduce the flexibility to such an extent that nothing new can ever happen, and actually you're going to start doing damage. And that's what's so scary about some of those Spain examples. People are just going to leave because it's just become such a ridiculous amount of rules and things to follow that people don't even want to be there. And then who knows what's going to happen with the underground market and all this extra stuff that's happening. It's not going to be good.
You've hit the nail on the head there. This was a point I was hoping to make, is that the big news in legislation is usually bans. Yeah, that's the big headlines. That's the stuff that affects people now. That's the stuff that causes big problems. But that's not really where the animal rights fight is. The real fight is in bureaucracy, is the slow death, the slow creep of hassle, headaches and problems and effort. And at the point at which there are so many rules, and I think the case in Florida is a good example of this, where you bring in so many rules and so many hurdles to jump through and so much administration, there is no way that people can effectively follow it, which was a big part of the case down in Florida. People just can't possibly do the right thing. People can't possibly stay within the law when you've got so many laws that you're in trouble whatever you do. So that's the first one. And the second one is, it has two other consequences. The first one is, okay, there's so many laws, there's so much problems, so much bureaucracy and paperwork, I'm just not going to bother. Yeah, that's the first problem. And so that shrinks the trade, shrinks the science, shrinks the amount of people who are involved in reptile keeping. But the other problem is that people who look at the laws and look at the rules and go, yeah, sod it, I'm going to ignore them. I'm going underground. I'm going to be legal. So show me how excess bureaucracy, legislation, positive lists, show me how that works. Because it's not doing anything for welfare. It's not doing anything for compliance. It's not doing anything for good science. I simply cannot see how anybody would think it's a good idea. It's a terrible idea, whichever way you look at it.
I mean, there's examples of all over the place. I mean, you can look at, communist states and whatnot where there's an over bureaucracy and it becomes, you're eating grass because there's no food around. It can get really bad because there's so much rules that, again, that you reduce the flexibility, and there's nothing. You only have two choices. You basically just have to break the rules, and it doesn't really work. And with Spain, do they have an issue with is it California king snakes that are invasive there? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because someone's going to say, oh, there is an invasive species and they are creating damage. I don't know if they are, but
Cali kings, that's a good story. I like that one because I've got a friend over in Gran Canaria that I go and visit regularly, and we go looking for Calis while we're there. So it's happening. And there are two populations: the normal coloured banded population, and there's another albino population, and they're at separate ends of the island. So we know what we're going to find dependent on where we're looking. And yes, they're an introduced species that are causing some problems in Spain. But let's look at it in more nuance. One of the problems with animal rights campaigning, and most of the conversations that we have, is that the arguments are polarized. It's either this or this. It's black and white. Ban them, don't ban them. Ban them, don't ban them. That's not how any topic in the world can be discussed. We have to discuss it with the nuances, with the circumstances, with the different examples inherent. So coming back to Californian king snakes. Firstly, are Californian king snakes invasive in Spain and causing a problem? Yes. However, how many cats are there in Spain that are causing a far greater problem than the Californian king snakes could ever cause? Comparing the two problems, Californian king snakes shrink into minuscule nothingness compared with the problems caused by cats and development and roadkill and all of the other things that are causing problems for Spain's fauna and flora. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the ban on Lampropeltis getula, by the way, it's not just Calis, it's all of Lampropeltis getula, are banned across the whole of Europe. Now, Britain got its way out of this a little bit by leaving Europe and that's a different conversation for another day. And I'm pretty sure that Britain won't be taking that law, although across the rest of Europe they're all banned. And there's a couple of things to discuss there. The first way is that the European ban works in such a way that you can't say, yes, we agree that this species could be invasive and a problem, but this species isn't a problem. The whole list of all of the invasive species that are proposed by all the different countries, and king snakes were proposed by Spain, you either have to vote to implement the whole list or vote to implement none of the list as a country. Yeah. So if there's something on that list that you know is a problem, but you don't believe callies are going to be a problem, you can't say, oh yeah, we like this bit, but not that bit. You have to vote for the whole list. That's the first thing.
So it's a binary system.
Yeah. But secondly, why would callie kings be banned in Sweden, Britain, Poland, in the cold areas of Europe where they have absolutely no possibility of being a problem? So again, it's unfair legislation, it's unnecessary legislation, it's overreaching in terms of its effect and underreaching in terms of its usefulness.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. It's there's better ways of going about this than a ban.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I really try to focus so much on what positives herpetoculture provides greater society, because I think that's so important for people to understand. Is, we already talked about some
force for good.
Exactly. And what are some of those things? And the more we focus on that, the better, because then the public goes, oh yeah, no, I remember, the reptile guy came over for my son's birthday and it was a great time. And then my son's super interested in reptiles, and instead of watching TikTok, he's outside looking for snake, whatever. I mean, you can go on, There's all these different cascades of experience that kids can have, and like you said, a net positive in society. And it's so important that we focus on those things. So are you, in general, are you quite optimistic about where we could be headed, or right now is it sort of too turbulent to say?
It's my job to be, and I quote my friend Chris Newman here because this is one of his favorite sayings, it's my job to be optimistically pessimistic.
Okay.
So we set up Responsible Reptile Keeping in order to be a dedicated media department for the international reptile keeping hobby and trade. So if you're a media department, our job is to tell our side of the story. And that's what we're doing best. We fight that fight on 4 fronts, which I'll speak to you about shortly. But am I optimistic? If we look at the trajectory of where we're headed, I shouldn't be optimistic, because the problem is growing and growing and growing. And I think there are more problems now than ever before. And most people don't even know what the problems are and don't know how bad they'll be if they come to pass. And this is one of the great problems of advocacy organizations. If advocacy organizations do really well and no bad laws come in, everybody says, well, there's no problem here. There's no reason for this big furore about what could happen. It's like crying wolf. So that happens. Whereas if the problems do happen and legislation does come in, they say, hey, what have these advocacy organizations been up to? That's what we pay them to do. So we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. Our success, and this is where I'm optimistic, our success as an organization comes from how well we do our job in getting our side of the story out there. Our success is measured by the waves that we're causing, by the buzz that we're creating, by the amount of times our information and content gets shared and liked and commented on. Our success is born of that. We can broadcast all we like, but if our content isn't being perpetuated and shared widely by keepers, we can't hit everybody. We can't knock on everyone's door and say, hey, here's some information. We need our supporters to do that for us. And I'm confident that if we can embrace that principle, I'm confident that if we can get keepers to share our content and for our voice to be widely heard, we can do what the internet does best, which is to harvest supporters, harvest opinion, change people's opinion, give them the information they need to make a credible, well thought out position on reptile keeping, on the reptile trade and on the reptile hobby. That's what we That's what we need to do. And if we can do that, then that makes me confident.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that you want to garner that organic interest where people are, organic supporters, where people find you and are totally on board with the message. And it's not a sort of a contrived thing where, you have a media, like an ad campaign or something attempting to get people to buy onto the message. It's like, no, it's honest communication with keepers and giving them the tools that they need. Because a lot of people don't, that was always a question I would ask at the beginning of this, starting this podcast was, why should we be allowed to keep reptiles? And a lot of times I would tell keepers, you want to almost picture yourself in a courtroom, and then a defense lawyer asks you that question, and are you able to give an elevator pitch for why we should be able to keep it, or why you should have the privilege to do that? And a lot of times people don't, because they don't want to think about that. They are just interested in having these animals and being able to interact with them. But I think it is important that we have. Yeah. It's understandable, and there's nothing wrong with that too. We're not going to ask everybody to be able to craft a perfect argument, but for those who want to, well, there should be resources there that they can kind of cling on to.
Well, that's what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to create the resources that people can use. We've thought about how we want to and how we should transmit these messages, convey this information, and we can use our skills as communicators, as journalists, as designers, to make sure that that message gets across concisely and engagingly. We use a 3-tier principle, which is engage, inform, enrich. Firstly, we need to catch your eye. We need to engage you. We need to go, hey, look at this. This is cool. This is interesting. This is worth having. So then we've got your attention. And then we inform you. We give you some information, and we put that information in a way that's useful to you and interesting to you. And the last thing, we're enriching people. The information that we give across is useful. It does something for you. It has an effect on you. And that's what we do. And we can do that. That's what we do best. Getting people to share it is vital. And we've been launched for about 4.5 months now. And we're absolutely staggered by the amount of support that we have. We did not believe for a minute that within the first year whether we'd have any traction at all. Mm-hmm. And we've been staggered by the amount of good support we have. We receive emails every day. We receive good messages on social media. We see the statistics for social media. People are doing exactly what we hope they do. People are supporting us in exactly the way we hope they'd support us. And that makes us confident. I can feel a tide shift happening. There are now far more people interested in advocacy and protecting the hobby and protecting the trade than there ever used to be.
Yeah.
The news is out there. We're creating a gang of supporters, a gang of advocates who will get our message out there for us and with us. We'll keep creating content if you guys can keep sharing it for us.
Yeah. And you'd mentioned that you have 4 tactics that you use in order. Do you want to run through those?
Yeah, these are kind of 4 things that we aim to do as an organization. And the first one is fighting against animal rights propaganda. That's a pretty easy one to do. We can usually pick great holes in their arguments, and where they have a point, we'll kind of use that to help make the trade better. There are points about the trade that we feel should change, and I'll come on to that. But certainly most of the animal rights organizations are so flawed, disingenuous, and propaganda based that it's easy for us to create content like the 75% video and say, hey, here's one side of the story, but actually here are the facts. So that's the first thing we do. We fight against animal rights propaganda. The second thing we aim to do, and our next video will be a good example of this, is we want to improve welfare, because bad welfare gives animal rights groups ammunition to fight us with. Now, when I say improve welfare, I don't mean kind of talk about which UV light is the best or which substrate is the best for crested geckos. That's a far more advanced process than we have time or indeed the knowledge to do. What we're talking about is the stuff that gets us, fights back and bites us on the bum. Things like, please don't release your animals into the wild. That's a welfare issue that's just so obvious that people should be doing something about, So that's that. Things like, maybe don't feed your reptile so much that it becomes obese. Yeah. These are easy arguments for us to talk about, and it helps stop keepers and hobbies from doing the things that animal rights people could weaponize against us. Our podcast with Tariq about reptile obesity comes out, I think, in the next couple of days. So that's the second thing. Firstly, fight animal rights people. Secondly, improve welfare that could come back and bite us on the bum. The third thing is being politically active and having a political voice. Animal rights campaigners usually have half a dozen or more people on their side of the table, all saying the same thing, singing off the same hymn sheet, approaching it from, their side of the story. We've got a precious few people advocating for us. So we want to be one of those people sat behind the table, advocating, helping to create communications that the advocacy groups can use to get our message across more easily. So that's the third thing. And the fourth thing, and I think this is vital, although this is somewhat in the future because we simply don't have the funds to do it. The keepers and trade and responsible keepers are way behind the curve in terms of how much research that we have on our side advocating for us, telling our side of the story. Animal rights campaigners have paper after paper of so-called scientific research that they rely on. Now, let's ignore the accuracy or efficacy of that scientific research. We know that it's largely flawed, but they do have it. And pretty much gone are the days when you could turn up in Parliament or turn up at your Senate meeting or whatever, and the animal rights people put their scientific papers on the table and you say, well, I've been doing this for 30 years, so I can tell you that that's wrong. That used to be effective. Now they say, right, where's your science? Where's your peer-reviewed papers? Where's your research? And we largely don't have it. So we'd like to fund that research, and we would hope that in doing so, we'd harvest information that helped the trade and helped the hobby. Sometimes we'll do research and we won't like what it sees, and we'll have to swallow that, you know? If
and
we're
in some
here
ways,
for
that's
responsible keeping.
yeah, exactly. It gives you credibility to say, hey, this is how we thought we should keep. We did this little study on welfare, and it turns out we're wrong about this thing. Let's make that widely available for everybody to make the shift. So we don't want to seem like we're ideologically bound to just keeping reptiles, like I said earlier. Yeah, exactly. We just want to keep. It's a right to keep.
We've done this in the UK quite well, self-regulating. There was a problem back in the 80s and 90s where we were importing thousands of captive farmed iguanas and selling them to beginners. That's something that was part of the trade. And eventually all the traders got together with Chris Newman from Reptile and said, hey, every iguana you sell is a lost customer, because the odds on that customer being happy with their purchase and having a big, happy, friendly animal that they got on really well with, that doesn't happen very often at all. They end up with a 6-foot monster that tries to eat them, has complicated nutrition, complicated UV needs, and they're probably not going to be happy with their purchase. So, hey, how about if we sell them a leopard gecko? How about if we sell them a bearded dragon instead? Maybe they'll be happier. Maybe they'll stick around longer. And there's various occasions like that where in the UK, at least, and I'm sure in America as well, the trade has looked at itself and gone, hey, do you know what? Maybe we shouldn't be bringing in all those tiny little swifts that live for a month. Maybe we shouldn't be, keeping these animals that aren't really great pets for most people. I think most reptiles can be kept. I'd probably even say that all reptiles can be kept by the right keeper.
Yes. Yeah.
But those types of keepers are few and far between, and most are better off with bearded dragons, leopard geckos, crested geckos, Greek tortoises, corn snakes. That's what suits most people. So let's make happy customers. But that's certainly something that we need to look at closely, research, making sure we've got a responsible trade and a responsible hobby. And that's the name of our organization, and we'll stick to that position.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's super well said. And at the end of the day, everybody here in this hobby, first and foremost, is an animal person. And at the end of the day, what we want is what's best for the animals. And all of what you just said is the animal is at the top of that pyramid, making sure that their welfare is taken care of, that not only the individual animal is taken care of, but the population within captivity and the population in the wild. That's what we love. We love the animals, and we want to make sure that that's obvious. It shouldn't be like, why do you keep weird animals in your basement without having an explanation? We want people to say, like, look, these are animal people. They love the animals, and they actually, we should be able to show that we like them more than the so-called animal rights groups that maybe aren't doing anything. Well, as far as I'm concerned, aren't really doing much for the animals. Like you said, we could list all these different things that have happened in herpetoculture that are a huge benefit to society. So I think you're going about it the exact right way, and I'm not surprised that people are becoming more enthusiastic about it and supporting you because it's what people want. And I think there's been a giant hole in herpetoculture, and people are kind of craving this.
Yeah, that's the feedback we're getting, and we're really encouraged by all the feedback, because honestly, we sat at home for 6 months planning this and wondering, why hasn't it been done before? Maybe it's because it can't be done or shouldn't be done, or there's some great trip hazard, or and there's reasons why it hasn't been done before. So we were really stepping out into the darkness and hoping this thing took off and hoping this thing worked. And it's been fabulously encouraging. The feedback that we're getting is astounding, and it's very supportive. Now, something I should say is that the vast majority of feedback we're getting is, hey, you guys are doing it right. This is perfect, wonderful. We love what you're doing. And that's lovely to have. And when we work hard and we create content, we hope that it'll do the job. And when people tell us it is doing the job, that's great. What's also useful is when we hear feedback that gives us an idea of how to do things better. Mm-hmm. We're very new at this. We understand communications, we understand reptiles, we understand the advocacy side of things, and that Venn diagram crosses over and we sit in the middle of it. But we don't think that we're perfect. We know that there are things that we could do better, and the only way we can do better is if people let us know. We're so grateful for great feedback that helps us to become better, and your viewers can certainly help us with that. Don't be shy. I'm a big boy. We can take it. Give us some feedback, share our stuff and tell us what you want to see. Tell us what we can do. Tell us what we can do better. We love that stuff, and we'll thank you for it.
Yeah, I think you will hear feedback for sure, and I think criticism and not criticism, constructive feedback is always really beneficial, and we just need to keep sharpening the tools, because we are fighting up against giant organizations here.
Oh, goodness.
Is there anything that we didn't say today that you wanted to wrap up with? Because I think we did cover almost everything on our list, and like I said, I'm super excited, but I want to give you a final word if there's anything that you wanted to wrap up with.
I don't think so. I think the only thing I can finish with is a bit of blatant publicity,
Please.
Because I'm expecting that some of your, or maybe most of your viewers might not have come across us. So if you go to our website, you'll see all types of different content. You'll see podcasts, videos, interviews, articles, magazines, and a wealth of other stuff. And the reason we produce so many different kinds of content is that we know that people like to consume different kinds of content. It's no good us just producing in podcasts, because we know that some people want a meme, some people want a 5-minute video, some people want to read a magazine. So we're trying to produce as many different types of content to appeal to as many different kinds of people as we can. We also know that we can't just put this content on a dusty old website and expect people to go and find it. We have to transmit to the places where we know people hang out, and which is essentially social media. So we're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, we're on Substack, we're on Facebook, we're on Insta. We've got our own website, and we'll probably expand out into other platforms. So we're hoping that you'll come across our content or go and find it on our website or our platforms. Just type responsible reptile keeping anywhere on the internet, and we'll pop up, hopefully. So that's the first thing. So what can you guys do to help us? Well, a handful of things. As I mentioned previously, we only succeed if our broadcasting gets out there. We only succeed, the hobby gets better protected, and we get our message out there if your guys share our stuff, like our stuff, comment on our stuff. That stuff is gold for us. That's wonderful. That's the first thing they can do. The second thing they can do is join us as a member. We're a membership organization. We're international. The price of our membership is the same as a cup of coffee, or a large cup of coffee at least, but a cup of coffee. And what that does is a handful of things. Firstly, it recruits somebody to our organization and to our cause who's probably going to share our stuff. Second thing it does is it gives us more people on our side, faces and hands, where we can say, hey, we've got X amount of members. We got 20,000 members or whatever it might be when we're grown. These are the people that support our cause. So maybe you should listen to us. Yeah, that's vital. The third thing that it's important for is, of course, funding. We can't do what we do without funding. So while we're earning our day job, which we've essentially reduced to about half of its former size, we need to be working more on responsible reptile keeping. So that's the other thing, is funding, the third thing. So the last thing that your viewers can do is tag brands or companies. And what that will do is it will raise awareness amongst those companies and help us to have more credibility and more oomph when we approach them for funding. The more these brands and organizations are aware of our work, the more likely they are to support us. So if your guys tag brands, that would be really helpful. But yeah, we hope we're doing right. We hope we're along the right lines. Give us some feedback. Join us as a comrade, and hopefully we can ride this wave where we can stop the animal rights people from having it all their own way. Because at the moment they are. We need to be telling our side of the story, and we can only do that with your help.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really time for us to enter the discussion as well, and I think those are perfect call to actions for the listeners as well as myself. And I guarantee you, there's probably some brands listening to this right now, even as well. So the more awareness that we have around this movement and this organization, I think the better. Tony, this was amazing. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you have an incredible wealth of knowledge, just the history of herpetoculture, but also I love the vision. I think this is so needed, and I'm super excited that even you're only in 4 months and you've already built such a fantastic organization. It's going to be a year from now, it'll look totally different, and it's going to be bigger and better, and it's just going to keep going. So thank you so much for not only joining me on the podcast today, but doing what you're doing, because it's much needed and phenomenal.
I really can't thank you enough as well. Obviously, your reach and your popularity means that we'll be able to get that there to more people than we ever have done. So I can't thank you enough for getting us on board. And next time I'm in the USA, hopefully we can grab a coffee or a beer.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Tony, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. You are an incredible wealth of information, and I just thank you so much for putting this organization together. I cannot wait to see how it evolves over time. As I mention on the podcast all the time, it is our responsibility as responsible reptile keepers to promote our positive nature to the people who aren't in the hobby. It is tough to explain to somebody why we are a benefit, but we are a benefit to the greater society, even for people that aren't interested in keeping reptiles, whether that's introducing people to, or young kids to, animals, helping in conservation, breeding new species in captivity for the first time, helping with preservation, connecting people with nature. That's a huge part. People living in cities, they don't even see trees sometimes, or grass. Having a beautiful enclosure that connects people with nature and reminds them why it's important that we don't devastate the natural world with, logging and whatnot. And there's a laundry list of things that are really positive about herpetoculture. And I think responsible reptile keeping is going to do a great job of arming everyone with those facts and those concise points that you can actually use to defend yourself against some of these wild claims that come from the animal rights groups. And we have to admit, sometimes the animal rights groups do have decent claims. Maybe there's enclosure sizes that are too small, or maybe there's bad things happening in the wild caught trade. Those are things that we have to accept responsibility for and use them and integrate that and move forward and stop doing whatever those things are. But there's obviously a lot of claims, as we mentioned in the podcast, that are so outlandish and false but they create great headlines, so it becomes very difficult to fight against. So anyway, Tony, thank you so much. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that podcast. If you do have some spare change kicking around, make sure you head to Responsible Reptile Keeping website. That'll all be in the links in the show notes, and you can join the membership there. If you're someone that doesn't have the extra financial change kicking around, no problem at all. As Tony said, one of the most powerful things you can do is just share the content, whether that's their Instagram posts or social media posts or YouTube videos. That really does help. If you're looking for more information on this podcast, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com. As always, thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this podcast. And thank you so much to all the patrons that really do help make this show exist. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can head to patreon.com/animalsathome. I will see you guys in the next episode.